Welcome, Wappin' Crew, new listeners, guys, gals, ghouls, friends, fiends, and foes. Secure your tinfoil hats, buckle down tight, and hold on loosely as we soar over the rocky tops of the La Platas on a rocky mountain high, get sucked into the vortex of the Four Corners, and settle down snugly at mile marker 420 in colorful Colorado. It is Sunday, March 12th, Monday, March 13th, for those of you across the pond and beyond. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you, and welcome to We Are Paradox Media's Late Night in the Rockies. I hope you guys have had an awesome weekend so far. Chilling with the family, relaxing, keeping cozy and warm, or just filling yourself. If you're listening to us live right now, you may be listening to us on KPNL Radio, which you can find on KPNL Radio at kpnl-db.com. You may also find us live right now on eTalk Radio, which you can find on eTalk Radio at etalk.tv/radio. You may also find us live at Spreaker.com under We Are Paradox Media. If you'd like to listen to us in your free time, whether you're working it or working out, please look us up once more under We Are Paradox Media at Spreaker, Twitter, Spotify, Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Facebook, Castbox, Tumblr, SoundCloud, TuneIn Radio, Deezer, Podcast Addict, Podcast Chaser, and Podvine. If you don't mind, please nosy on over to YouTube. Please subscribe, like any video that you've watched or listened to, and leave us a comment, whether good or bad. We like to hear it all. Tonight I have a treat for all my guys and gals out there. Tonight we have story time with me, your favorite podcaster, TessaTNT. Unfortunately, I won't actually be live with you tonight. This is a pre-record that I did earlier in the day because it is my daughter Nova's birthday. She's now 19 years old today. Happy birthday, Nova. Feel free to leave happy birthdays on my Facebook page. That would be lovely. So far as story time goes, you know the deal, you know the spiel. We will be reading for the first 2 hours from a book, and then the third hour we will read ghost stories from Reddit. So this hour we are reading from Robert Wilkins' wonderful book Death, A History of Man's Obsessions and Fears. I've really been enjoying this book. It's enlightened me to a certain extent. Hopefully you feel enlightened too. So on this chapter, Death and Resurrection, we have a section called The Anatomy Act of 1832. Henry Warburton made his first attempt to introduce an anatomy bill in Parliament in 1829. Essentially, Warburton's bill would have provided for the needs of the anatomists by giving them the bodies of those who were unclaimed after death. In practice, this meant the pauper dead. The bill failed in the upper house because their lordships asserted that even the poorest citizen had a right to expect a decent burial. This principle of posthumous equality was enunciated in a contemporary broadcast. For the hearts is filling with affection pure, dwell in the breasts of the neglected poor, as ever warmed the sun of wealth and pride, who in their splendid places reside. Warburton used the public hysteria surrounding the activities of Williams and Bishop to bring his second anatomy bill to Parliament in 1832. Although the aim of this bill was the same as the first, the dissection of unclaimed bodies, Warburton had made a number of subtle changes in order to make it appear more acceptable and to disguise the fact that, after death, the poor bodies must be cut up and mingled for the benefit of their lords and masters. The key clause in the first bill, the bodies of persons unclaimed dying in any hospital or workshop may be delivered for dissection, was substituted in the second bill by persons having lawful custody of bodies may permit them to undergo anatomical examination. The new wording successfully obscured the reality whereabout workhouse keepers would be able to sell the body of any unclaimed pauper who died in their institutions. Further, it was hoped that the euphemism, anatomical examination, would soothe the conscience of those who found dissection too direct. Advocates of the bill were quick to point out that there were many safeguards against abuse by the unscrupulous. Any person, rich or poor, who did not wish to be dissected had merely to express his desire, either in writing at any time during his life or verbally in the presence of 2 or more witnesses, during the illness whereof he died. In addition, no one would be dissected against the wishes of a surviving spouse or relative. But it was pointed out that none without consent was not the same as all without dissent. Warburton chose to ignore the fact that most paupers were illiterate and that the workhouse keepers might have a vested financial interest in making sure no witnesses were present. Indeed, workhouse keepers might be tempted to supplement their income by burking their residence and legally selling the bodies. Warburton's bill was successful. It included a clause which abolished dissection of murderers. Ruth Richardson, in Death, Dissection, and the Destitute, neatly sums up the change in the law. What had for generations been a feared and hated punishment for murder became one for poverty. She goes on to wonder whether a dying pauper would take comfort from the knowledge that he or she would be dissected on the slab instead of a murderer, rather than alongside one. The provisions of the Act were summed up by one enthusiast thus: "It has legalized human dissection in Great Britain and Ireland. It has permitted cultured, brave, and honorable members of the medical profession to escape the slimy tentacles of the resurrectionists. It has provided the student of today with facilities for anatomical study, under such surroundings as would have brought pains from the lips of Andreas Vesalius, William Harvey, and John Hunter. It put an end to the vocation of the sack-em-up men. To the public, the always indifferent and stuporous public, it has given original, brilliant, and life-saving surgical operations. Thus it was that the poor came to supply the needs of anatomy. But then, as now, poverty could come swiftly to a well-to-do. In a letter to the Lancet of 5 June 1829, a Worcester man, who signed himself one of the unclaimed, related how he had possessed property to the value of £20,000, but had become bankrupt by foreclosure of a mortgage. As a result of penury, his wife had died of grief and his daughters of tuberculosis. He described himself as the poverty-stricken and emaciated inmate of a workhouse, without a single relation to notice me. He viewed the prospect of dissection with horror. Gracious heavens, and can this take place in England, in the abstract dissection in heavens should disregard, but I look with horror upon being classed with and treated like a murderer. The Anatomy Act of 1832 is still in force today. Happily, voluntary bequests make the need for pauper corpses unnecessary. Memorial in Mass. Communal graves are usually associated with pauperism, pestilence, or pogroms. In such burials, posthumous identity and the focus of most religious obsequies are lost. Towers of Silence. One religious group, the Parsees, who make no provision for individuation of the dead, would argue that remembrance by the living is neither shortened nor diluted. The Parsis are descendants of ancient Persians who fled to India to escape religious persecution. They adhere to the teachings of the prophet Zoroaster and have a unique method of disposing of their dead. A visitor to Bombay in the 1870s asked his host about the purpose of 5 huge black granite towers covered with white chunam and disfigured by black fungus-like incrustations. Each tower was roughly 40 feet in diameter and 25 feet high. The oldest had stood for over 200 years. The parapet of each tower possesses an extraordinary coping, which instantly attracts and fascinates the gaze. It is a coping formed not of dead stone, but of living vultures. They sit there so motionless they might have been carved out of stone. The upper surfaces of the towers were divided into 72 receptacles, with grooved channels to convey moisture into the central drains. The receptacles were arranged in 3 concentric circles. The outermost for male corpses, the middle for female, and the innermost for children. The purposes of the vultures may now be divined. At least 100 birds collected round one of the towers began to show signs of excitement, while others swooped down from neighboring trees. The cause of this sudden abandonment of their previous apathy soon revealed itself. A funeral was seen to be approaching. The body of a child was taken by bearers into the tower and left uncovered in one of the receptacles. A dozen birds swooped down. In 5 minutes, the satiated birds flew back and lazily settled down again on the parapet. They left nothing behind but a skeleton. Roughly 2 weeks later, the beaters returned, and with gloved hands and tongs, placed the bones in the central wall to intermingle with the bony fragments of their ancestors. Zoroaster, who lived 6,000 years ago, taught that earth, fire, and water must never be defiled by contact with putrefying flesh. Decaying bodies must be dissipated as quickly as possible, and God has provided vultures to dispose of human flesh more expeditiously by far than ants and earthworms. And the mingling of one's bones with those of others of the same faith was regarded as a symbol for communal remembrance. Bone houses. Although the Christian preference was for separate burial, intermingling of the bones of the dead was often the practical reality. We have already seen that shortage of land frequently necessitated the disinterment of the long dead, and the replacement with the recently dead. Exhumed bones were usually collected together and placed in a charnel house, or ossuary. In rare occasions, exhumed bones were taken into the body of the church and have thus survived to this present day. 2 vast bone collections, which are still in existence in Britain, can be seen at St. Leonard's Church in Hythe, Kent, and Holy Trinity Church, Rothwell, North Hampshire. On display in the crypt of Hythe are 8,000 thigh bones and 2,000 skulls. Experts estimate that the bones represent remains of 4,000 people buried in and later exhumed from local burial grounds in the 13th and 14th centuries. Perhaps the most awesome display of bones is to be found in the Capuchin convent in Rome. Here, and not to everyone's taste, tens of thousands of bones are arranged, rather like our memorial displays in military museums, in intricate designs on the walls and ceilings. Skeletons of children hang from ceilings holding bony scales of judgment. One may ponder on the fact that although the individuals comprising the display are anonymous and long forgotten, the composite effect is indeed memorable. Grimmer still, by some people's reckoning, are the works of Frederick Rush, 1638 to 1731. He used to arrange the skeletons of foetuses and children in the form of tableaux interspersed with human organs and stuffed birds. One such tableau was a foetus crying into a handkerchief made of human membrane, probably placental. Ruysch's collection was purchased by Peter the Great, Tsar of Russia. Chapter 2. Defilements of the Famous. Part of the price to be paid for fame in one's lifetime is sometimes to run the risk of defilement after death. Many reasons can be given for the opening of a grave or vault, to check that the alleged occupant is indeed in residence, to transfer the incumbent to a more prestigious sepulchre, to take bits for souvenirs, to raise money by ransom, or, more usually, to take revenge on an adversary. An early example of revenge exhumation was the abuse perpetrated on King Harold Harefoot, reigned 1035 to 40, son of King Knut, by his half-brother Harthnut, reigned 1040 to 42. According to the Chronicle, William of Malmesbury, he, Harthnut, ordered the body of Harold to be dug up, the head to be cut off and thrown into the Thames, a pitiable spectacle to men, but it was dragged up again in a fisherman's net and buried in the cemetery of the Danes at London, now St. Clement Danes. 600 years later, the need to settle old scores was again amply demonstrated by the defilement of Oliver Cromwell. Cromwell, the corpse they knocked about a bit. Oliver Cromwell, Lord Protector of England and responsible for the trial and execution of King Charles I, died of fever in 1658. He was buried in Westminster Abbey. 2 years later, on the restoration of the monarchy, the followers of Charles II were looking to revenge themselves upon the regicide. Cromwell's body was disinterred from Henry VII's chapel and was hanged at Tyburn in front of a jeering and jubilant mob. The corpse was then decapitated, and the head was spiked on the roof of Westminster Hall, where, according to tradition, it remained for 25 years. One stormy night, a high wind lifted the grisly relic from its spike and deposited it at the feet of a sentry, who bundled up the desiccated head and took it home. At this point, the whereabouts of the head becomes shrouded in mystery. In 1787, an actor named Russell sold it to a museum near Clare Market, which in turn sold it to Josiah Wilkinson for £230. Wilkinson would take the head, still fastened to its spike, to parties. His grandson, Horace Wilkinson, of Seven Oaks, presented the head to Cromwell's old college, Sidney Sussex, in Cambridge. Questions as to the authenticity of the relic were answered by comparing the features of the head to those of the death mask taken at the time of Cromwell's death. A distinct mark was identified on the hard, parchment-like skin over the right eyebrow, close to the bridge of the nose, the site of Cromwell's famous wart. The head has been buried at Sidney, Sussex, in a location known only to a small number of college staff. King Charles I's posthumous adventures. It is one of the ironies of history that Cromwell flatly refused Charles I's wish to be laid to rest in Westminster Abbey, a very church from which Cromwell himself was so unceremoniously removed 13 years later. Charles I was beheaded on 30 January 1648, and his body was transported to St. George's Chapel, Windsor, where it was finally deposited in the vault occupied by Henry VIII and his favorite wife, Jane Seymour. Charles II always professed to want to reinter his father's body in the chapel of Henry VII at Westminster Abbey, out of whose loins King Charles was lineally extracted, but somehow he never seemed to get around to it, and by the time he gave the plan active consideration, most of the people present at the original interment at Windsor had themselves died. For this reason, and because extensive alterations had taken place in the meantime, the whereabouts of King Charles I's body had been forgotten. It was not until 1813 that the coffin was rediscovered, when a workman accidentally broke into the vault during the construction of a mausoleum of Mad King George III. On April 1st, 1813, the plain lead coffin inscribed King Charles 1648 was opened for the Prince Regent in a company of dignitaries, which included Sir Henry Halford, physician to the king, who had had much to do with many crowned heads in their lifetime, and who now had the opportunity of examination, the one that Cromwell caused to be removed. Inside the lead coffin was a decaying wooden one. With great care, the wrappings were removed from the dark, discolored face. The left eye, in the first moment of exposure, was open in full, though it vanished almost immediately, and the pointed beard was perfect. The face bore a strong resemblance to that of Charles I, as preserved on coins and medals, and in pictures of Van Dyck. Not surprisingly, the head could be easily removed from the trunk and was quite wet. The hair was found to be cut short at the back, either to help the axeman's aim, or else as a consequence of mementos having been taken by friends. The fourth cervical neck vertebrae was sliced clean through. No examination was made of the rest of the body, and the head was replaced and the coffin soldered. Henry Halford has been accused of having palmed the king's cervical vertebrae and having it mounted in a case of lignum vitae lined with gold, to show his dinner guests. The bone was finally returned by one of Half-Lord's heirs and placed back in the king's coffin in 1881 by order of the Prince of Wales, later King Edward VII. Halford was not the one who carried off a memento of his visit. It is claimed that a workman crossed to Henry VIII's coffin and removed a finger bone, which he subsequently had fashioned into a knife handle. John Milton, 1608-74, author of Paradise Lost, was a supporter of Cromwell. After the restoration of Charles II, Milton lived quietly in the country and was buried in St. Giles Without, Cripplegate in London. 19 years later, his grave was opened and desecrated. A journeyman named Holmes produced a mallet and chisel, and forcing open the coffin so that the corpse, which was clothed in a shroud and looked as if it had only just been buried, might be seen. Mr. Fountain, one of the overseers, then endeavored to pull out the teeth, but, being unsuccessful, a bystander took up a stone and loosened them with a blow. There were only 5 in the upper jaw, but they were quite white and good. They, together with some of the lower ones, Mr. Fountain and 2 others divided them. A rib bone was also taken, and the hair from the head, which was long and smooth, was torn out by the handful. After this, the caretaker, Elizabeth Grant, took the coffin under her care, charging 6d to anyone who wished to view it. Later, she reduced her fee to 3d and finally to 2d. Defilement by exhumation versus buried and retrieved. Dante Gabriele Rossetti, 1828 to 82, is principally remembered as one. Let's see, I think I missed a page. What the heck? As one of the founder members of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, which advocated a return to pre-Renaissance ideas about art. But Rossetti was also a poet of great distinction. This macabre tale concerns the retrieval of some of his long-buried verses. In 1860, Rossetti married Elizabeth Siddal, the beautiful model of many of his paintings. 2 years later, Elizabeth suffered from tuberculosis, took her own life with an overdose of laudanum. Rossetti was overcome with grief. As she lay in her open coffin, in a gesture of eternal love, he placed between her cheek and her famous golden red hair a book of manuscript poems which he had written for her. Elizabeth was then buried at Highgate Cemetery. Alas, his need for secular fame as a poet began to cast doubts on the propriety of such a romantic but futile gesture. Rossetti wanted the poems back but agonized for 7 years on how the retrieval might be brought about. Finally, in October 1869, with permission from the Home Secretary, a gang of resurrectionists began digging in the Rossetti plot. The poet himself stayed at home, consumed with guilt, in a state of agitation and torturing suspense. By the light of lanterns, the coffin was opened and the poems reclaimed for the benefit of the living. After disinfecting and drying, they were taken to their author. They were published as poems in 1870. When he inquired, the poet was told that Elizabeth's pale beauty remained unimpaired by 7 years underground. One is tempted to observe that his informers were unlikely to report otherwise, in order to upset the artist's sensibilities. Grave robbery, ancient and modern. It might be thought that the best method of ensuring that a corpse is safe from the attention of thieves is to enclose it deep within a vast edifice of stone with all routes of entry securely blocked. Such was the theory behind the construction of the pyramids. Unfortunately for the pharaohs, the reality was very different, since such a gigantic temptation always proved irresistible to plunderers, who would invariably find a way of stealing its funerary treasures. It is for this reason that all the pyramids are now empty. It is also the reason that ostentatious burial went out of fashion in ancient Egypt and replaced by unadorned shafts burrowed in secret locations in the Valley of the Kings. Of course, the vast amount of treasure that was needed to ensure the pharaoh's status in the other world remained a powerful lure, and discoveries of undisturbed tombs such as that of Tutankhamun are exceptional. In 1875, an Egyptian peasant, out searching for his lost goat, came across a deep shaft. It was the entrance to a tomb in which had been buried generations of pharaohs and which for thousands of years had escaped attentions of robbers. By the light of a candle, he could make out the mummified remains of many of the most mighty rulers of the ancient world. Amenophis I, Thutmose II, Thutmose III, Seti I, Ramesses II, through 40 in all. For 6 years, the Abd el-Russel brothers and their extended family systematically rifled the treasures of the tomb. Given time, they would undoubtedly have turned their attention to the mummies themselves. For many centuries, rich Europeans regarded mummy wrappings as a cure for all ills, a veritable panacea. Before long, entrepreneurs argued that if the wrappings were so powerfully medicinally, how much more potent must the actual body be? Thus was born a thriving trade in pulverized mummies. Some famous Renaissance physicians, notably Ambrose Pare, railed against the practice of desecrating the dead that they might serve as food and drink for the living. Pare maintained that a mummy caused rather than eased stomach pains and was more likely to worsen bleeding than staunch it. But still, the demand for mummies continued to outstrip supply, and the limited source soon became seriously depleted. It was then that the criminal resourcefulness came into its own. Fresh corpses were stolen from modern Egypt's cemeteries, eviscerated, soaked in a blackish material called asphaltum, and finally left in the sun to dry. After a few weeks, the bodies were ready for powdering in flourishing mummy factories. This cannibalism ceased only when the Egyptian government taxed the factories out of existence. The export of whole mummies from Egypt to the museums of Europe and North America continued long after the trade in powdered mummies had ceased. Some were later subjected to the minutest scientific examination, including dissection thousands of years post-mortem. Margaret Murray in Manchester was a pioneer in the field. Modern thefts of bodies. Examples of thefts of famous bodies for ransom or barter include an elaborate plot hatched in 1876 to steal the corpse of Abraham Lincoln and exchange it for the freedom of a guild counterfeiter. The gang were discovered and the plan was foiled when they had lifted the wooden coffin half out of the sarcophagus. As body snatching per se was not a crime, each was gaoled for a year for violation of a tomb. 25 years later, to discourage a copycat crime, Lincoln's coffin was embedded 6 feet deep in steel and concrete. Bungling is the hallmark of the majority of instances of thefts of bodies for ransom. In December 1881, a gang of neo-resurrectionists broke into the vault of Dunnart House, Aberdeenshire, and stole the body of Alexander William Lindsay, 25th Earl of Crawford in Balcarres, who had died a year before in Florence and whose embalmed body had been shipped back to Scotland. An anonymous letter was received by the family. "Sir, the remains of the late Earl of Crawford are not beneath the chapel at Dunnart, as you believe, but we recovered hence last spring, and the smell of decaying flowers ascending from the vault since the time will, on investigation, be found to proceed from another cause than flowers. Signed, Nabob." The letter did not have the effect intended, since it was regarded as a tasteless hoax and ignored. 2 months elapsed before the exasperated grave robbers were forced to dispense with subtleties. They returned to the vault, tore down the iron railings which had enclosed the entrance, and propped up the granite slab leading to the crypt. The police were called, and Inspector Cran descended into the vault. An empty coffin stood in the middle of the floor, its inner lead shell peeled back like an opened can. The smell referred to in the letter was the stench of impregnated sawdust in which the body had been packed. Another letter soon followed, demanding £6,000 for the safe return of the corpse. What happened next often bordered on farce. The police called in the services of a bloodhound called Morgan, which preferred to chase rabbits. In July 1882, the Earl's body was eventually found wrapped in blankets and buried in a shallow grave less than 500 yards from the house. And shortly afterwards, following a tip-off, the police arrested Charles Sauter, a mole and rat catcher. The Earl was then deposited with his ancestors in a more secure vault in Wigan. Part of his inscription reads, "He shall give his angels charge over thee. He that keepeth thee will not slumber." Body snatching is not unknown in our own times. In March 1978, the coffin containing the body of Sir Charlie Chaplin, was stolen from a cemetery at Corsier-sur-Vevey, overlooking Lake Geneva in Switzerland. Charlie Chaplin had died the previous Christmas Day, aged 88, and had been buried in the village where he had spent the last 25 years of his life, following allegations of political and moral offenses in Hollywood. The theft followed 2 attempts to steal the remains of other celebrities. The ashes of the opera singer Maria Callas, disappeared from a Paris cemetery on the day in which Charlie Chaplin was buried. And in August 1977, 4 men had attempted to steal the body of Elvis Presley from its marble mausoleum. It was accepted that the theft of Chaplin's body had no political motive. Other explanations included exhumation so that he could be reburied in Westminster Abbey in Britain, the country of his birth, so that he could be reburied in a Jewish cemetery, theft by an insane fan, or else ransom, pure and simple. Chaplin's widow, Una, daughter of the playwright Eugene O'Neill, refused to pay a ransom and was reporting as saying, "My husband lives on in my heart and mind, and it really doesn't matter where his remains are." Chaplin's coffin was finally found 11 weeks later in a shallow grave in a cornfield about 10 miles from his former resting place. 2 men, a Pole and a Bulgarian, were charged with having demanded a ransom of £400,000 and with having disturbed the peace of the dead. The Pole, reckoned to be the brains of the operation, was gaoled for 4 years, and the Bulgarian, regarded as the muscle man with a limited sense of responsibility and background of family problems, was given a suspended sentence. Charlie Chaplin was reinterred in a concrete vault. Saintly bits and pieces. The more pious a man's life, the more likely he was to have his anatomical parts stolen and venerated after death. Saintly bits and pieces are enshrined in gold and silver throughout the churches of Christendom. In addition to the intrinsic religious significance of such holy relics, they invariably brought great prestige to the church or city that owned them. Cologne benefited financially from the pilgrims who journeyed to see the shrine of the 3 wise men, or magi. Pandits would even attempt a hierarchy. Heads, arms, and legs were the most venerated bits, fingers and teeth the least. Very important relics were divided up and widely distributed. John the Baptist's face ended up in Amiens, the top of his head in Rhodes, the back of his head in Nemours, his brains went to Nogent-le-Rotrou, his jaw to Besançon, and a bit of ear to Saint Flour in Auvergne. Relics were traded in the political arena, much as gifts are exchanged in contemporary state visits. A patriarch of Jerusalem gave Queen Radegund of France a finger which once belonged to Saint Mami, and the monks of Mount Sinai presented one of Saint Catherine's ribs to Henry II of Brunswick, and a finger to Rouen Cathedral. On the death of Saint Hugh of Lincoln, the corpse was decapitated in order that the value of the relics could be instantly increased. During his life, whilst on a pilgrimage to Normandy to venerate the alleged remains of Saint Mary Magdalene, Hugh had bitten off 2 pieces of bone from the saint's arm to take back to England as souvenirs. During the Reformation, Henry VIII was responsible for a precipitous reduction in the number of relics. On his orders, the bones of Thomas à Becket were plundered from his shrine at Canterbury and burned, though his skull is reputed to have been preserved to lie now under the corona at the east end of the cathedral. It is a mischievous apocrypha to suggest that Henry intended to put the skeleton of Becket on trial for treason more than 400 years after the martyr's death. In 1542, Henry's henchmen meted out the same treatment to St. Cuthbert, lying peacefully in Durham Cathedral. They broke into the shrine and found Cuthbert's body uncorrupted. Because of the remarkable preservation, the superstitious king ordered that the saint be reinterred beneath a plain marble slab. Some authorities maintain that Cuthbert's body was removed by monks and buried in a secret location. To check out this rumor, Cuthbert was dug up again in 1827, this time by the cathedral authorities. By that time, the body had become corrupted, and Cuthbert was a skeleton swathed in fabric. The saint's identity was no longer in doubt when his gold cross with a garnet at its center was discovered in the coffin. Incredibly, in 1899, he was exhumed yet again, before finally being placed back under his marble slab inscribed Cuthbertus. The bones of many less saintly notables still sometimes come to light. In 1896, a box of bones was found on a shelf in the Louvre Library. The bones, allegedly collected after the rifling of the royal tombs of the Cathedral of St. Denis in 1793, included a scapula of Hugues Capet, a femur of Charles V, a tibia of Charles VI, a vertebrae of Charles VII, and a rib of Philip the Fair, and one of Louis the XII's, and a lower jaw of Catherine de Medicis. Galileo's fifth lumbar vertebrae, a bone in the spine, was stolen in 1757, and now rests in Gabinetto Vecchio in Padua. The astronomer's withered finger was placed in a glass vase in the Museo di Storia Naturale in Florence. The English king, Edward the Martyr, was murdered in 979, stabbed by his stepmother. The bones were moved from Wareham to Shaftesbury Abbey, Dorset. They disappeared when Henry VIII sacked the monasteries, but reappeared in 1931 when a gardener unearthed a casket while digging in the abbey ruins. When the owner of the land died in the 1950s, her two sons disagreed on the most appropriate disposal of the bones. One wished to reinter them in the abbey grounds. The other wanted them to be given to St. Edward Brotherhood, who had promised to enshrine them at Brookwood Cemetery, Woking. Until recently, the royal bones were deposited in a cutlery box in a vault in Midland Bank, Woking, but today Edward's remains lie secure at Brookwood. Napoleon's private bit. It was not only holy men who ran the risk of exhumation and of having bits of their anatomy removed after death. When Napoleon died, his chaplain, Pere Vignali, helped himself to a number of anatomical relics, including a mummified tendon. This specimen, whose diminutive and shriveled appearance gave a new meaning to "Not Tonight, Josephine," had had many owners over the years before being auctioned at Christie's in London in 1969. It failed to reach its reserve prize. Disturbing the dead in search of a king. That antique pile behold, where royal heads receive the sacred gold. It gives them crowns and does their ashes keep. They make like gods, like mortals, there they sleep. Making the circle of their reign complete, these sons of empire, where they rise, they set. Thus, Edmund Waller, 1607-87, described Westminster Abbey's dual function, to crown and bury English monarchs. Francis Beaumont, the Elizabethan dramatist, had also alluded to the Abbey's preeminence as a royal cemetery. Think how many royal bones sleep within these heaps of stones. Here's an acre sown indeed, with the richest, royalest seed. The area around Westminster also had a third function. It served as a royal residence. This was in stark contrast to St. Denis, the burial place of the French kings. Not only did French monarchs never live at St. Denis, they rarely ever visited the place during their lifetime. Louis XIV chose to live in Versailles in part because from Saint-Germain he would still catch sight of the towers of the hated abbey in which he would finally be laid to rest. James I, the first Scottish king of England too, died in March 1625 and was buried in Henry VII's chapel at the eastern end of Westminster Abbey. Unfortunately, no one knew precisely whereabouts in the chapel the king lay, since the abbey records were contradictory. The mystery was not solved until 1869, when Dean Stanley finally tracked down James's final resting place. The story of the search weighs in the balance scholastic curiosity and the disruption of the peace of the royal dead. Since one of the earliest records written only 56 years after his burial cited James's grave in a vault on the north side of the tomb of King Henry VII. This seemed the most logical place to start the search. Duly, the marble pavement was carefully lifted, and a spacious vault with 4 coffins was discovered immediately. To Stanley's surprise and disappointment, the occupants proved to be the second Duke and Duchess of Argyll and their 2 daughters. Next, Stanley decided to strike out to the southwest of Henry VII's tomb, where he soon received another surprise. He found a single coffin of lead, rudely shaped to the human form, to which was attached a silver plate giving the name and title of Elizabeth Claypole, the favorite daughter of Oliver Cromwell. The isolated position of this vault probably explains why Elizabeth was not disinterred with her father and the other members of the Cromwell family on the restoration of the Stuart monarchy. Northwest of Henry VII is the Sheffield Chapel, containing the remains of the first Duke of Buckingham of the Third Creation, 1648 to 1721. On lifting the pavement, a vault was discovered, which conformed precisely in the dimensions to the one in which an abbey record, dated 1723, places the bodies of James VI and I and his queen, Anne of Denmark. In the center of a large vault was a red coffin bearing inscription Regina Anna. The 6'7" coffin, corroborating accounts of Anna's remarkable height, was badly corroded and had collapsed inwards over the queen's face and body. Anne of Denmark had been found, but there was no trace of her husband, despite the accounts that the two had been buried together. In the west wall of the vault, 2 leg bones and a piece of skull were found, and it occurred to some that they might be all that was left of the first Stuart king of England, defiled at the hands of parliamentarian soldiers who had once occupied the abbey. The search for James henceforth took on a new urgency. An eastern wall closed off another vault with an impure atmosphere containing several coffins belonging to members of the Buckingham family. If James had not been interred with his wife, perhaps he lay with his mother. Consequently, attention now turned to the vault of Mary, Queen of Scots, situated in the south aisle of the chapel. It was here that the remains of this unfortunate queen had been brought from Peterborough Cathedral by her son. A flight of stone steps was soon uncovered, leading to a large vault beneath Mary's tomb. A startling, it may almost be said, an awful scene presented itself. A vast pile of leaden coffins rose from the floor. Some of full stature, the large number varying in form from that of a full-grown child to the merest infant, confusedly heaped upon the others, while several urns of various shapes were tossed around in irregular positions throughout the vault. The first coffin to be identified was James VI's first elder son, Henry Frederick, Prince of Wales. A soldered case contained his heart, below which was discerned the Prince of Wales' feathers. Through the collapsed lead casing could be seen the still lifelike appearance of this Stuart prince, in whom so much hope had once been invested. Arabella Stuart lay on top of the corpse of Mary, Queen of Scots. Also laying to rest were the bodies of Mary, Princess of Orange, Prince Rupert, and Anne Hyde, James second's first wife. Then there were the multitude of smaller coffins, representing the numerous progeny of that unhappy family. Infant after infant, fading away, which might else have preserved the race. First there were the 10 children of James II, including one whose existence was unknown hitherto, James Darnley, natural son. Then the 18th children of Queen Anne, only one of whom, William, Duke of Gloucester, lived into childhood. The most notable absentee was James VI first. The search then diverted to the north aisle and the tomb of Elizabeth I and Mary I. In contrast to the Stuart vault, the Tudor vault contained only the 2 coffins, Elizabeth lying on the top of Mary. There were no signs of disorder or decay. Elizabeth's coffin, made of elm and oak, was decorated with the Tudor rose and initials ER and the date 1603. With the 2 aisles fully explored, only the central floor of the chapel remained to be investigated. A shallow vault in front of Henry VII's remained to be investigated. The tomb contained the body of Edward VI, the son of Henry VIII, who died in 1553 at the age of 16. Identification was aided, if such was needed, by the fact that no hair was attached to the skull, coinciding with the description of Edward's fatal illness. Eruptions came out of his skin and his hair fell off. In the southeast of the chapel, opposite the vault which contained James's queen, excavations revealed not a vault, but an earthen grave containing a lead coffin in an advanced state of decay. There was evidence that the body had been embalmed. The skeleton was a man, roughly 6 feet tall, with good teeth. There was no identity plate. Could this, at last, be the body of James the 6th/1st? It was thought most unlikely on 2 counts. Firstly, the Abbey records clearly refer to the building of the vault to receive James's body, there being no reference to an earthen burial. Secondly, and more conclusively, James was of a short stature. It was probable that the skeleton was Charles Worsley, parliamentarian general, and the Elizabethan Claypool, the only Cromwellian to remain buried in the Abbey after the Restoration. So on that note, boys and girls, we are going to go to our first music break. On this break, we have Mr. Jeff Hilliard of Los Angeles, California. He's going to be singing Abandoned, Consensual Sex Van, Cocknut Hills, Finger Banger Day, as well as Multitude. You guys don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after this music break.
Why won't you answer my calls? Just get in the van.
Desperate and pathetic. Nothing but a coward. You're a fool with nothing to offer. No one will ever believe you. They see you for what you are. You're just a fraud, a shell of a person. And now the marvelous fear of between the demons that love you. They enslave you into the dungeon of the hate. I am the son of
When your life is a never-ending train wreck and you feel like you're drowning in a sea of regret, with a bit of oppression pressing down on your neck, it hurts so bad. When your overwhelming hatred kills your heart's desire and reality starts looking like a dumpster fire, you start bitching to me, but that you're preaching to the choir. You don't need to be so mad. 'Cause sometimes we hurt, sometimes we cry, sometimes we're sure there's no reason to try. When the whole world goes completely insane, open your heart, stand up and sing. I'm gonna finger bang my day. Yeah, yeah, I'll finger bang my day. That's right. You gotta make the choice to give it all you've got and make your day long with pleasure, really make it hot. Because your day deserves a lover that pulls out the stops. Come on, it's not so hard. 'Cause sometimes we hurt, sometimes we cry, sometimes we're sure there's no reason to try. When the whole world blows up in our face, what else could we do but stand up and sing? I'm gonna finger bang my day. Yeah, yeah, finger bang my day.
Hey, what are we really doing? We can't live in a world that has this much hate. We have to get honest with ourselves. We have to take stock in what our part is in all of this madness. We have to let go, and we focus on giving love, setting that intention. And each and every single one of us gets up every day with the intention to give love. And we do it. We go out there and we give love every single day. Each one of us gets out there and makes love to our day, giving our day a multiple orgasm. The whole world will be orgasmic for the rest of eternity.
Sometimes we hurt, sometimes we cry, sometimes we're sure there's no reason to try. When the whole world is fucking insane, we open our hearts, stand up and sing. I'm gonna finger bang my day. Finger bang my day. Finger bang my day. Let's open our hearts, stand up and sing. I'm gonna finger bang my day. Yeah, yeah. Finger bang my day.
I got molar moves, got that molar too. You think it's wrong? I could've had too long. Fuck that. Check these molar moves. You need a molar too. I can do no wrong. Back of the head long, never gonna cut it.
All these hookers sweet on me. Look at them chasing me, showing me that ass. And I banged up snatch. I do this shit for free. Go down your mom till 3. She's taking selfies with the mullet like it's history. How can I maneuver you with that pussy, dude? You sit like Buddha waiting on it to come to you. My lines are straight to the point. She shows me gratitude. So what's your latitude? Let's adjust your attitude. Hit up with a alligator, double dually Lamborghini. All up in a silly little yellow polka dot bikini.
I got molar moves, I got that molar too. You think it's wrong? Back of the head too long. Fuck that.
Hit up with a alligator, double dually Lamborghini. All up in a silly little yellow polka dot bikini.
Check these molar moves. You need a molar too. I can do no wrong. Back of the head long, never gonna cut it.
Hit up with a alligator, double dually Lamborghini. All up in a silly little yellow polka dot bikini. You're like the butt of a butter, not cutting up panini. So climb back in your kangaroo pouch like a rolling genie. These moves are hot, these locks I got. The
Welcome back, and thank you so much for joining me this evening on We Are Paradox Media's Late Night in the Rockies. So we're going to continue on with our book, Death, A History of Man's Obsessions and Fears. At this stage, it would appear that every conceivable space in Henry VII's chapel had been explored, save only the tomb of Henry himself. There was a great reluctance to accept the idea that the first Stuart king would have elected to be buried away from his queen and in a vault of the founder of Tudor dynasty. Nevertheless, before James could be said definitely not to lie within the chapel unless represented by the bones in the wall of Anne Denmark's vault, it was imperative to investigate Henry's tomb. The vault was approached from the west, and before too long an entrance was discovered under the first stone arch. It was with a feeling of breathless anxiety, amounting to solemn awe, which caused the humblest of the workmen employed to whisper with bated breath, as the small opening at the apex of the arch admitted first glimpse into the mysterious secret which had hitherto eluded this long search. Deep within the arched vault were dimly seen 3 coffins lying side by side, 2 of them dark gray with age, and the third somewhat brighter and newer. The copper plate soldered onto the coffin on the northern side was inscribed, Depositum Augustissimum me, Principes Jacobi primi, Magnae Britanniae, Francae et Hibernae Regis. The long quest for James, King of Britain, France, and Scotland was finally over. The other 2 coffins were indisputably those of Henry VII and his wife, Elizabeth of York, the latter wedged uncomfortably between the 2 kings. It is a curious historical coincidence that James VI's first son, Charles I, came to share the same vault at Windsor as Henry VII's son, Henry VIII, and his wife, Jane Seymour. Chapter 3. Necrophilia and Vampirism. Penthesilea, dead of profuse wounds, was despoiled of her arms by Prince Achilles, who, for love of that fierce white naked corpse, necrophilie on her committed in public view. Necrophilia, the most reviled of all perversions, is taken to mean pleasure derived from sexual intercourse with a corpse, and represents posthumous indignity in its grossest form. Necrophilia, especially the incestuous variety, was a favorite theme in the writings of the Marquis de Sade. Henry Blotte indulged his necrophiliac perversions on a number of disinterred corpses, including an 18-year-old ballet dancer whom he dug up at St. Owen in 1886. When he was finally brought to trial, he offered a bizarre defense, chacun à son goût, le mien est pour les corps. Everyone to his own taste, mine is for bodies. It has been suggested that within the ranks of undertakers and embalmers, necrophiliacs are overrepresented, and that the problem was recognized in ancient times. Herodotus, describing Egyptian embalming techniques, commented that wives of prominent men and women of great beauty are not delivered at once to the embalmers, but only after they have been dead 3 or 4 days. This is done in order to prevent embalmers from having carnal relations with these corpses. In the strictest meaning of the word, necrophilia was never considered a variety of sadism, since sadism infers inflicting pain, which is impossible on an insensible corpse. Yet emotions were sometimes strongly felt towards the dead victim. A gravedigger's assistant defended himself against a charge of necrophilia by saying that, since he could find no live woman to yield to his desires, he saw no harm in giving affection to a dead woman. Indeed, they never repulsed his tender advances. Monks keeping vigil over the dead and soldiers at the front sharing cramped quarters with dead comrades were also thought to pose an increased risk of necrophilia because of long-suppressed sexual drives. Aries, in his The Hour of Our Death, retells a story first attributed to the surgeon Antoine Louis in 1740. A monk was asked to keep vigil over the recent dead body of a beautiful young girl. Indeed, so lovely was she that the monk quite forgot his vows of chastity. The monk made love to the corpse, only she was not a corpse. The dead girl revived after the monk's departure and gave birth to a baby 9 months later. Doctors were thought not to be immune. Many attribute sexual motives to Robert Knox and his behavior towards the naked body of Mary Patterson, referred to on page 67. A contemporary cartoon showed the day of resurrection in a London anatomy school and featured a woman demanding the return of her virginity, lost since her arrival. Vampirism, as most of us understand the notion, is the return from the grave of the living dead to feed off the blood of those still living. Bram Stoker's Count Dracula is the archetypal vampire, replete with needle-sharp incisors to feast on the jugulars of sleeping virgins. But necrophilia and vampirism are terms which often overlap and are used to describe the activities of the living who become sexually aroused by corpses, including the sucking of blood from the dead. There are many well-documented cases of necrophiliacs who have indulged in vampirism. In 1827, a 29-year-old man violated and mutilated the body of a 12-year-old girl and drank her blood. Fritz Harman, the Hanover vampire, was executed in 1925 after having killed 24 adolescent men and indulging in vampiristic and necrophiliac activities. In the early part of the 18th century, it was not unusual in Eastern Europe to dig up the bodies of the dead to check if they had become vampires. The spur for such activities was often the death of a suicide, murder victim, or drowning victim, whose burial had been followed by a spate of unexplained deaths. If on exhumation the body was identified as that of a vampire, staking through the heart was reckoned to rid the community of his unwanted attentions. In 1725, Peter Plagojewicz died in Kisilova in Serbia. Within a week, 9 others went to their graves, each claiming on their deathbeds to have been visited by Plagojewicz. Hysteria soon resulted in the clamor to open his coffin. This accomplished, the telltale signs of a vampire were not hard to find. The hair, beard, and nails had continued to grow since burial. The skin had peeled away, and a fresh layer had grown to replace it. His erection testified to his post-mortem sexual desires. The body showed no signs of decomposition, and as final proof to persuade the skeptics, there was fresh blood trickling from the corner of the mouth, sucked from his victims in his nocturnal feasting. Plagojewicz was staked through the heart and burned, and his ashes were scattered. A second exhumation is cited by Paul Barber in his Vampires, Burial, and Death. It concerns a shoemaker of Breslau who cut his throat in 1591. For a while, his widow persuaded everyone that he had died naturally of a stroke, but rumor remained rife and concerned numerous sightings of the ghost of the shoemaker, who was prone to come into people's beds, lie beside them, and squeeze so hard as to leave finger marks on their necks. On 18 April 1592, 8 months after his death, the shoemaker come vampire was dug up. The body was found bloated and foul-smelling, but supple and undecayed. A second skin had grown, and the throat wound gaped red, and a mysterious mole had appeared on his big toe. The corpse was later decapitated and dismembered, had the heart cut out from the back, and was finally cremated. Many of the so-called signs of a vampire will be recognized as natural post-mortem phenomenon. Growth of hair and nails, the peeling off of the upper layer of skin to expose a new skin underneath, whose red color was taken as proof of ingestion of blood from living victims. The pressure of gases formed as a consequence of putrefaction can adequately explain a variety of vampire signs. The erection, the oozing of blood from the mouth, the bloated, well-fed appearance of some of the corpses. The groan of the vampire, as he was staked through the heart, was due to forcible expulsion of gas from the chest cavity through the mouth. Sir Astley has my heart. Thomas Hood, 1799 through 1845, wrote a comic poem, Mary's Ghost, a pathetic ballad, in which he described the disposal of various bits of a lady's anatomy after she had been delivered into the hands of the anatomist. Her ghost complains to her lover. The arm that used to take your arm is took to Dr. Weiss, and both my legs are gone to walk, the hospital at Guy's. I vowed that you should have my hand, but fate gives us denial. You'll find it there at Dr. Bell's, in spirits and a phial. I can't tell you where my heart is gone, but Dr. Carper can. As for my trunk, it's all packed up, to go by Pickford's van. The cock it crows, I must be gone. My William, I must part. But I'll be yours in death, although Sir Astley has my heart. Chapter 3. The Fear of Body Disintegration. One, mummification in Egypt. Many people who can face the prospect of death with equanimity balk at the thought of the slow disintegration of the body in its grave. Numerous civilizations have attempted to arrest or delay this process. In ancient Egypt, it was necessary for the body to be preserved, since it was believed that the soul of the dead would return to reoccupy its former carcass. It was imperative, therefore, that the soul should be able to recognize its own body, since only by this means could the deceased hope for life in the next world. Consequently, the Egyptians' fear of bodily disintegration was rooted in religion. The art of mummification in Egypt evolved over a prolonged time scale. Before 1500 BC, mummification was crude and experimental. It became elaborated and refined in the period from 18th to 21st dynasty, roughly 1500 to 1000 BC, after which it went into slow decline. Much of what we know today about the embalming methods used by the Egyptians was recorded in the 5th century BC by the Greek historian Herodotus. The first step in the mummification process was the removal of the brain. Herodotus tells us how this was done. They, the embalmers, drew out the brain through the nostrils with an iron hook, taking part of it out this way, the rest by pouring in drugs. Archaeological examination of a mummy's skull usually reveals a hole in the delicate bones which form the base of the nose, through which the brain substance was scooped out. It is believed the hook, after breaking through into the cranial cavity, was moved in numerous lacerating sweeps in order to liquefy the brain and facilitate its flow down the nostril in a face-down position. Sometimes the operation was bungled, resulting in gross mutilation of the nose. Such a lack of expertise accounts for the noseless face of Tausert, priestess of Amun in the 22nd dynasty. Another method of removal of the brain was to decapitate the body and spin out the tissue through the natural hole in the base of the skull through which the spinal cord exists. The brain was never preserved, even in its liquid state, since the Egyptians considered it an unimportant organ. The heart, not the brain, was considered the seat of the soul. The eyes, the other organs prone to rapid putrefaction, were also removed at this initial stage. Interestingly, on some occasions the eyes were left in situ, having shrunk to the back of the socket. Sometimes it has been possible for scientists to rehydrate the eyeball, allowing it to expand to its former size, presenting a grayish cornea between half-open lids. Removing the internal organs. There were two types of Egyptian embalmers: paraschists and terashutes, cutters and salters. Using a sharpened Ethiopian flint, the paraschists would cut into the left side of the abdomen, either vertical cut from the ribs down to the pelvis or a transverse cut just above the parallel to the groin. Although the incision was rarely more than 6 inches long, the hole made into the abdomen cavity was sufficient for the embalmer to insert his hand and draw out the viscera, intestines, stomach, liver, and spleen. The kidneys, lying as they do, flat against the back wall of the abdomen, were generally left undisturbed, as was the bladder. To reach the inside of the chest, the embalmer would cut through the diaphragm that divides the chest from the abdomen. By this route, and by plunging his arm up into the armpit, the embalmer was able to reach the back of the throat. He would then cut the trachea, windpipe, and esophagus, gullet, and extract the lungs through the abdominal incision. The heart was always left in place, since it was regarded as the seat of all emotions and the core of a person's character, and therefore vital for eternal life. Next, the chest and abdominal cavities were cleansed with water and palm wine. The excised organs were preserved separately by treating with molten resin, wrapped in linen and placed in canopic jars, each topped with a representation of the head of one of the 4 sons of Horus, guardians of the entrails. The jars were sealed and kept for burial with the body sometimes inside the body itself. The female reproductive organs, uterus, tubes, and ovaries, were always removed. A linen tampon was placed inside the vagina, and the external genitalia were covered in a resinous paste. A man's penis and testicles were always left in place, except in the case of Seti I and Ramesses II, when they were removed and preserved inside a statue of the god Osiris. The Egyptians would have known about the drying out of bodies when buried in shallow graves beneath the hot desert sun, but such a natural dehydration process would have been impractical because of the length of time necessary for mummification. Consequently, the embalmers had recourse to a chemical method of dehydration, using natron, a mixture of sodium carbonate, washing soda, and sodium bicarbonate, found in deposits along the shores of the lakes between Cairo and Alexandria. There's been a lot of controversy on such heated debate among Egyptologists as to exactly how the natron was used as a dehydrating agent. As a solid substance or in liquid form, some experts thought that the bodies were weighted down in huge vats of liquid nitron. As the natron began to work, bits of flesh would separate from the body and float to the surface. Vigilance would have been needed to ensure that bits and pieces from different bodies were not mixed up. Lack of proper surveillance was given as the explanation for the finding of some mummies with missing legs and others with 3 arms. The question was finally settled by Lucas, who compared the preservation of pigeons when immersed in a solution of natron or buried in dry natron. The pigeon treated in natron solution was quickly reduced to an offensive-smelling carcass, from which all flesh had been dissolved. The bird packed in dry natron was recognizable, dry and well preserved, although a little shrunken. It seems certain now that the Egyptians packed the body inside and out with dry natron, which they left for 40 days. After that time, the dehydrated corpse was then washed and dried with towels. The embalmers usually began by pouring hot resin into the hole through which they had drawn out the brain. Then the body cavities were stuffed with lichens, sawdust, or bundles of cloth impregnated with resin. Sometimes onions were put in the abdomen. For greater realism, painted onions were placed in eye sockets, as in those of Ramesses IV. What emerged from the dehydration process was a dry, hardened, and stiff corpse, which had to be made supple before bandaging. The softening of the skin was achieved by massaging the body with sweet-smelling oils and grease. Constituents of the ointment included cedar oil, oil of turpentine, cumin oil, incense, and minerals. Resin was then poured into the cavities and left to solidify around the stuffing. The abdominal incision was rarely stitched. Usually the two edges of the cut were brought together and hot wax poured over to make a seal. Next, the mouth and nose were filled with cloth, and the body was painted red for men and saffron yellow for women. Later refinements in the 21st dynasty included methods of making the corpse less emaciated by packing mud, sand, and sawdust between the cheeks and gums, between the muscles and skin of the neck, thighs, buttocks, and limbs. There were a number of ways of arranging the arms of a mummy. Often they were crossed upon the chest, hands touching the shoulders. At other times, the arms were laid out straight, hands touching the thighs in women and covering the genitals in men. The bandaging of a mummy was a complex and time-consuming procedure, which could take anything up to 2 weeks to complete. The bandages were made of linen impregnated with resin. It is clear that the wrapping of a mummy was carried out in stages. 2 mice which had burrowed into the bandages were trapped when fresh layers were added, their skeletons being discovered during unwrapping 3,000 years later. Some high-ranking mummies had ornate gold funerary masks placed over the head and shoulders, while other lesser worthies had to make do with a cardboard covering called a cartonnage. In later times, portraits painted on wood covered the face. Social standing and mummification. The mummification process, as described above, was lengthy and costly and restricted to the rich. The less affluent dead risked their chances of eternal life in the afterworld by having to submit to bargain basement procedures. The method of preservation of the working class was evisceration per anno, which consisted simply of injecting large amounts of cedar oil into the bowel through the anus. The anus was then plugged and the body laid in natron for a number of days. After this time, the liquefied contents of the abdomen, intestines, stomach, liver, and spleen were allowed to pour out of the anus. The corpse was then bandaged and buried. A third method, reserved for the poorest classes, consisted merely of a purge of natron. An intriguing sidelight of embalming practices was provided by the discovery of the mummy of Princess Macaire. She was a priestess and a virgin, so how did such a celibate come to have the mummy of a baby occupying her coffin? She had succumbed to earthly temptation, became pregnant, and been condemned to death with her child. The mystery was finally resolved in 1968 when an X-ray of the baby showed it to be a baboon. Macaire had been buried with her pet to keep her company in the afterlife. Embalming of animals was very common in ancient Egypt, and countless thousands of mummified animals were buried in huge necropolises. Animals such as bulls, rams, cats, dogs, ibises, crocodiles, worshipped in the town of Crocodilopolis, and many other species. In 1859, a cat graveyard was discovered and 300,000 mummified felines were disinterred and shipped to Britain for use as fertilizer. The expertise with which some of the pharaohs were embalmed was resulted in their preservation for thousands of years. Ramesses II, 1298 to 35 BC, died in his 29th year, having reigned for 65 years, married 200 women, and sired 96 sons and 60 daughters. Today at Cairo Museum, he can be seen in such a good state of preservation that it is even possible to identify the blackheads on his nose. Hatshepsut, 1520 to 84 BC, retains her royal dignity more than 3 millennia after her death. She can be seen with her left hand folded over her breast as if holding a scepter, and her long brown hair falling about her shoulders. This extraordinary woman proclaimed herself pharaoh, insisted on dressing as a man, and having herself depicted in portraits with a beard. The embalming of Sequenem at the end of the 17th dynasty was much less successful, probably because he died a violent death. Whether he died in battle or was assassinated is uncertain. What is obvious for all to see are the wounds which brought about his end. Sequenem's brain was not removed prior to embalming, and his body had already begun to decompose. Even today, people comment on the revolting smell given off by his mummy. The head shows multiple fractures of the forehead, eye socket, and cheekbone, probably caused by an axe. A javelin penetrated below the left ear and embedded itself in the top of his spine. The mummy of Hinatali fared just as badly. Poor technique resulted in excessive mud being injected under the skin. Instead of its producing a more lifelike appearance, her skin split and separated from her face, producing a grotesque effect. Ramesses VI is equally grotesque, but his appearance is the result of knife cuts wielded by grave robbers. Amenophis also suffered from the attentions of robbers, who pulled off his right hand and both feet. A fascinating sidelight on the examination of Amenophis in 1974 was the faint scent still given off from a 3,000-year-old spray of delphiniums. 2. Mummies of the world. Talk of mummies usually conjoins and conjures up images of Egyptian pharaohs, particularly the magnificently ornate mummy of Tutankhamun, discovered by Howard Carter in the Valley of the Kings. The centuries-old corpses, preserved by natural or artificial means, can be seen in countries as culturally diverse and as geographically separated as Peru, Australia, Japan, America, and Italy. Peruvian mummies. Preservation of corpses can occur by natural and artificial means, and has produced the wonderfully intact Peruvian mummies on display in our own time. The desert climate of coastal Peru, with its negligible rainfall and rarefied atmosphere and intense cold of Peruvian Andes, are both ideal for the retardation of decomposition and the product of natural mummies. Artificial preservation processes. The evisceration, smoke curing, and embalming were also used prior to the Spanish conquest of the Incas in 1532. It is estimated that in Egypt more than 500 million corpses were mummified, since people of all social classes wished to ensure life in the other world. In contrast, mummification in Peru was much more the prerogative of the rich, especially the Inca kings. Unfortunately, no Peruvian equivalent of Tutankhamun exists, although the royal mummies were known to have been put on display in Lima in 1560. Their whereabouts thereafter are shrouded in mystery. In Egypt, mummification was usually performed for religious reasons, whereas in Peru, ancestor worship was thought to be the major incentive to preserving the corpses of chiefs and royalty. Those in possession of the mummies of powerful ancestors became powerful themselves. The earliest Peruvian mummies date back to 4000 BC. 2 adults and 2 children were found as natural mummies in a cave 12,000 feet above sea level. The adults and 2 children were found as natural mummies in a cave 12,000 feet above sea level. The adults were wrapped in cloaks and trussed up in a typical flex position, knees drawn up against the chest. In Quai 9, on the coast, artificial mummification dated back 3,000 years has been discovered, with mummies showing brain removal, evisceration, limbs reinforced by sticks, and painted faces with wigs fastened over the heads. Perhaps the most characteristic method by which Peruvians preserve their dead was by tightly flexing the body, hands open flat over the face and secured with cord, covering with a shroud or poncho, and placing the cadaver in a seated position inside a coiled basket. Whether the bodies were artificially treated or not before being bundled has remained a contentious issue. Some experts declare that evisceration and smoking preceded bundling. Others believe that natural desiccation, together with the use of cotton wrapping to absorb the decomposition fluids, was the only process utilized. Sometimes the bundle was topped with a false head and painted mask. X-rays of such bundles have shown skeletons with bracelets and other jewelry sitting squat and snug on top of the radio-opaque mass of decomposition fluids. Recently, such a bundle, fardeau, was opened before an audience by Dr. Jimenez Borja. And bundle appeared so auspicious, weighing 300 pounds and needing 4 men to move it, that there was a great deal of optimism that an important archaeological find was about to be revealed. The mummified body of a pre-Incan princess, perhaps? In reality, the bundle contained cloth, linen, sand, branches of guamo trees, cotton balls, a tunic, pots of maize, and parrot feathers, but no mummy. What was revealed finally has defied explanation. And the last pile of feathers was the tiny mummified left foot of an adolescent girl, almost certainly severed while she still lived. Did it represent an ancient accident, a punishment, or a symbolic sacrifice? Some have suggested that the body may have been eaten by pumas or swallowed by a water snake, and that the foot was all that remained. With a macabre humor, she has been dubbed Cinderella of Sugarloaf Mountain. The most elaborate post-mortem preservation rituals were reversed for those at the top of the social ladder, the Inca kings. Flexed, trussed, and wrapped in cotton, the royal body waited 40 days before being placed in a sepulchre. The deceased's every need was catered for. Bags of old clothes, jewels, food, drink, wives, and concubines were placed in the vault. Special custodians were appointed to wait upon the dead king in perpetuity. Their duties included feeding him, washing his clothes, whisking away flies, and lifting the bundle when they deemed that the king wished to urinate. On state occasions, the royal mummies were dusted down and taken out of their sepulchre to be borne on stretchers and exhibited to the people. No mummy of an Incan king survived the Spanish conquest, but descriptions of their preservation allude to embalming with balsam or bitumen. Australasia. Mummification of the dead in Australia and Southeast Asia relied mainly on augmented natural processes and was not intended to preserve the corpse indefinitely. Mummification was generally part of a mourning ritual and was not a preparation for an afterlife. Consequently, very few Australasian mummies exist for study. Probably the most famous is the mummy found by Sir William Macleay in 1875 on Darnley Island in the Torres Strait between Australia and New Guinea, and displayed in the University of Sydney. The Macleay mummy is an adult male suspended on a ladder-like wooden frame by cords passing under the armpits. Natural siding in the vertical position has brought the shoulders level with the ears. The body was thickly coated with red ochre. Shells were placed in the eye sockets, on each of which was painted a black spot to represent the pupil. The nostrils were plugged with coral. The brain had been removed through an incision at the nape of the neck, and the intestines had been removed through an incision in the left flank. The genitals were complete, but there was no discernible pubic hair. Holes had been made in elbow joints and between the fingers in order to allow drainage of putrefying fluids. Expulsion of these fluids was facilitated by stroking and kneading the limbs. The fingernails and toenails were absent. So was the skin off each palm and sole. These items, together with the tongue, would have been represented to the surviving spouse. After many months of drying out in the heat of the sun, the mummy would have been decorated and the frame tied to the central post of the dead man's house. In time, the bodies usually fell to pieces, only the head being retained by the relatives. On some of the Melanesian islands, the skull would have been given to the nearest relation for use as a drinking cup. The body of a Torres Strait infant, aged roughly 30 months, is in the collection of the Royal College of Surgeons in London. It is tied to a rectangular wooden frame and, in most respects, was prepared by the same methods used in adult specimens. There is one intriguing mystery: the abdominal incision, through which the viscera were removed, is only 47 millimeters long, much too small an aperture for an adult hand to enter. Could it be that, in the same way in which men were employed to embalm men and women to embalm women, children were employed to embalm infants? That's kind of creepy. I wouldn't like to do that if I was a kid. Mummy miscellany. American mummies have usually been desiccated by natural processes. The bodies are most often flexed, wrapped in fur, and stored in caves. The majority have been found in Arizona, Colorado, and Texas. But perhaps the best-known American mummy was discovered in 1875 by two men in Kentucky, known as Little Alice. She was found lying on a ledge in Salt's Cave. In 1958, she was examined at the University of Kentucky and promptly rechristened Little Al on the discovery of external genitalia. The mummy is of a boy about 10 years old, probably a woodland Indian, deposited in the cave roughly 2,000 years ago. In Japan, 19 mummies are known, 15 of whom were priests who voluntarily sought self-mummification for religious reasons. The 4 secular mummies are the grandfather, father, son, and grandson of the Fujiwara family who lived in the 12th century in northeast Japan. The priests achieved self-mummification by starving themselves to death and then being interred in an underground stone chamber for 3 years, after which time they were exhumed, dried, displayed, and appear on and venerated whilst patiently awaiting Maitreya Bodhisattva, who would appear on earth 5,670 million years after the Buddha's attainment of nirvana. One priest Tetsumankai Shonin is reputed to have extracted his left eyeball and cut off his penis and scrotum before starving himself to death. Only a small number of Chinese mummies have been discovered. One female mummy, in a remarkable state of preservation, has such suppleness of her limbs that the arms can be flexed with ease. Well, that's interesting. Well, on that note, boys and girls, we're going to put the book away and get to our second music break. So on this break, we have Miss Mia Savage with her band, Antidote for Savages. She's going to be singing The Bottom Line, Your Skeleton, Not a Phase, and Lumerian Crypto. You guys don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after this music break. Welcome back, and thank you so much for joining me this evening on We Are Paradox Media's Late Night in the Rockies. So for the third hour, we're going to delve into Reddit ghost stories. This one is by u/Avon-6. Help identifying a spirit. Hello everyone. I am a 22-year-old male and am going to college in Ohio. I live in a fraternity house that used to belong to the town. The school buys out properties and houses students in them. My house has been displaying some interesting encounters. Last year, around February or March, one of my housemates and I were talking in the hallway outside of the bathroom. We were there for at least 30 minutes. Bathroom was empty, no one went in or out. Then the shower suddenly turned itself on. For context, the shower handle is one that points to the ground when off and rotates counterclockwise to turn it on. We looked at each other and went to check it out. The handle was turned 90 degrees counterclockwise. I turned it off and we resumed our conversation. Last semester, around September, I was at esports practice. One of my friends had sent me a Snapchat of my room from the outside, asking what I was doing. When I opened the photo, there was a figure standing in my room. This was more concerning, considering my room is a single and I am the only one with a key, outside of skeleton keys kept by campus security. At this point, we had assumed it was the spirit of the old man who, conveniently enough, passed away in the room that I'm in. At the end of last semester, around early December, my girlfriend, who is 20, and I were sitting on my bed talking. We heard a voice outside of my door. Both of our heads snapped in the direction, as it was either a young, female voice, and the rest of the house is male. When we asked the others about it, who were all downstairs, no one was outside my door. They all swear they didn't hear anything or do anything. A few weeks ago, I, my girlfriend, and one of my frat brothers and his girlfriend were in the living room playing Mario Kart when there was a sudden loud bang. We all went to check it out. The shower curtain rod had fallen from its fastened spot. 2 years living there, and it never fell before. Finally, last night was one of the weirdest. I had heard the same voice from last December, and it was trying to speak to me inside my own head. There was what seemed to be radio interference, best I can describe, as it kept cutting out. It began to imitate sounds outside. I'd hear a car drive by, then a few moments later hear a distorted version of it in my head. After this went on for a while, it screamed at me, "Fucking listen!" I hadn't planned on discussing this, hoping it was a dream, until my girlfriend told me she heard a growl this morning and asked if I had experienced anything. Our conclusion, as of now, is that there are two spirits in the house, the old man who's peaceful and whatever this other thing is. Any assistance on identifying it or general advice would be welcome. Thank you in advance to everyone's help. Updated information as of February 22nd, 2023. My 20-year-old fraternity brother, his girlfriend, my girlfriend, and I took turns going under with the Estes method. We got some partial information when the other three were under, but the spirit seemed to be extremely happy to speak to me as it yielded the most responses. This is going to sound weird, and I am still having trouble processing it all, but it seems that the spirit wants me. I'm not sure exactly what it means by that, but it definitely doesn't sound good. For example, when I asked, "What do you want?" the spirit would respond, "him," whilst I was under. My girlfriend has a somewhat special connection to energy. I don't know the official term, but she's an empath and feels that she can control how the energy flows through her. I don't know if I'm even describing that correctly. She has been using her energy to protect me, and the spirit knows it. It repeatedly was telling her to leave the room, leave the house, and not come back. We tested having her leave the room, and the aggressiveness increased, resulting in my quitting when I heard a voice scream, "He will be mine!" Chilled to the bone, I removed the headphones and blindfold and called the session to a stop. Since doing the Estes method about a week ago, most of the activity has died off, with the exception of things occasionally falling off their sound resting place. The TV randomly turning on, off, or pausing, and I am having a hard time staying asleep. A few days ago, my girlfriend and I both tested positive for COVID. Although I doubt it's connected to the spirit, it definitely has not helped settle any nerves, and we are now quarantined to my room. Hopefully this added info helps anyone who might have an idea of what's going on, or the previous commenters with additional thoughts of what to try next. Thank you to everyone who has prayed, thought of, or tried this far to help, and to anyone in the future who does the same. Updated info as of March 12th. Note, this was written right after the incident in my notes on my phone, so I could document the encounter and check for grammar later. I thought I had heard my girlfriend talking to me. She told me that she was missing me. She told me that she loved me. She told me that she was with me. Then I thought she told me to open my eyes, so I did so. I was met with the face of our squishmallow, Willie the Dragon. I began shaking violently, my heart racing and hearing a pounding in my head. I was completely terrified. I was unable to speak, trying to rouse her. I was trying to tap her with my foot, but to no avail. All of a sudden it stopped, and I am now typing this. I have never felt that way before. I have never had this occurrence before, and I am extremely freaked out. I don't think I'm sleeping for the rest of the night. Thoughts after reflection of the event. I don't know if it was the beginning phases of the possession, a panic attack, sleep paralysis, or a combination of a few of them. I have had an anxiety attack before, but this was a completely different feeling and experience. I've done some research online, but have not found anything useful yet. If anyone else stumbles upon this and has any idea of what may have happened, please tell me. I'm still freaking out. This one is by u/We're Never Klimt. A house in northern Maine. This is a story that I've written and deleted 2 or 3 times now. I have very bad memories associated with the house, so it's hard for me to write about. This telling is about something odd that happened many years after I lived in the house. I'll omit the bulk of the background. I lived in a 1900 farmhouse in northern Maine in Aroostook County, along the border of Canada. The house was a small 2-story clapboard-sided farmhouse. The central heat was a giant handcrafted metal stove. It was large enough to fit a log a foot in diameter and 3 foot long, and sat in the middle of the dirt-floored basement. The stove was so airtight that you could throw in several chunks of split hardwood and dog it down tight. Then you crack the air vent just a tiny bit, and the fire would smolder all night, with heat drifting up through the vents and ducts. It was the main heat in the house, although there were 2 additional cast-iron wood stoves. I lived in there with my father and his girlfriend. My father would spend a lot of time working on the property, clearing brush. He also worked on scraping and peeling paint and applying a fresh new coat. Although he refused to invest money in the house, so many of his repairs were low quality and incomplete. After I moved away, I stayed away for over 15 years. One day, my wife and I were staying at a hotel a few hours away and found ourselves with a free day to randomly explore. We ended up driving back to the area of that house and decided to make it our destination. The area hadn't changed much. The area is very sparse with a lot of dense trees and large grassy yard and fields. Farms here and there. We turned off U.S. Highway 1 onto the road named Wilcox Settlement Road. The house was maybe a quarter-mile down the road. The sun was low in the late afternoon sky, a bit above the trees. I pulled up at the end of the driveway, or dooryard as the locals call it, and stopped in the road. The house was a wreck, and in much worse shape than when my father had owned it. There were a few beat-up cars parked by the house. There were barrels and scrap wood and random old junk all over the yard and on the porch. Much of the siding had been removed, exposing mylar-backed foam insulation boards that had been pressed between the studs in the exterior wall. There was an old, dented, rusty pickup truck parked closest to the road, where we sat idling. My foot on the brake, my wife and I sat gaping at the creepy old dilapidated house. The yard was overgrown, and the brush had reclaimed most of what my father had laboriously cleared all those years ago. Movement caught my eye in the dimming light. A waving hand. There was a man standing on the other side of the old pickup truck, and he was slowly waving his arm, beckoning us toward him. He was a large, overweight man, late 30s to mid-40s, dressed in a dirty work coat. His mouth was open in a gape-toothed smile, and he stood there, still except for his upraised right arm, slowly beckoning us to pull into the driveway. I was frightened. First of all, we didn't see him initially, so it caught us off guard to have him standing as close as he was. Secondly, the way he stood there watching us, beckoning, reminded me of a scene from a backwoods horror film. The man's smile seemed to me a cunning veneer of harmlessness, belied by a bleary cold glint of greed or worse. I instinctively floored the accelerator and sped away. I hate that house. It was a very bad place. I felt like it was stained with bleak sadness, fear, and loneliness. This one is by you/the questionable moon. Imaginary friend ghost. When my cousin's son was little, he was super attached to his imaginary friend named Joseph. He would take Joseph everywhere and do things like demand that his parents buckle him into the car. So he was definitely more attached than most kids, but some kids just have really realistic imaginary friends, so they didn't think it was anything weird. Fast forward several years, my cousins have moved out of that house and their son is a lot older. One day, the dad runs into the family who had bought the house from them, who was a little boy of their own. As the conversation goes on, it gets brought up that the little boy who lives in the house now has an imaginary friend he is super attached to named Joe. Obviously, my cousin tells the family about his son who had his imaginary friend named Joseph while living in the same house. It's interesting, but they ultimately assume it's just a funny coincidence. Fast forward again to the present day. The last family moved out of the house, and for several years it sat vacant. Recently, someone bought the house and renovated it. One day, my cousin ran into the guy who was renovating it. They live in a small town. It's not weird that he keeps seeing the people who bought his old house. They were talking about the house, and my cousin mentioned the funny coincidence about the two boys having an imaginary friend with a similar name. At the point, the guy doing renovations tells my cousin that while they were taking out a wall in the house, they found an old journal that had the name Joseph written on either the cover or first page. Unfortunately, I don't think they kept the journal, but at the very least, it's a spooky coincidence. This one is by u/top_u5721. Haunted cabin? So I'm a pretty skeptical person when it comes to the paranormal, albeit having a vested interest in tales and evidence. I'm the kind of person who browses ghost hunter videos on YouTube and these kinds of subreddits. I've also visited plenty of purportedly haunted locations in the U.S., included but not limited to places like the Omni Park House in Boston, Molly Brown House in Denver, the Whaley House in San Diego, Alcatraz at night, and the Winchester House more than once. None of which have yielded any sort of evidence. A part of me wants to believe, but also terrified at the prospect of witnessing something. I was mostly a non-believer up until a couple of months ago. In short, I had wanted to plan a surprise party and get away for my girlfriend's 30th birthday. She had mentioned wanting to go hit the slopes. It was January, so it's still wintertime at this point. I organized this months ahead and had invited some of her closest friends to join. I ended up renting an Airbnb cabin that had enough rooms to house 10 people, or 5 couples. One entire lower floor basement level with 2 beds, a room on the first floor, and 3 rooms upstairs. Also adding that this cabin was in a beautiful rural neighborhood in Tahoe, California, with tons of cabins next door, down the street, adjacent, etc. So there's plenty of housing around us. Nothing peculiar about it, and there are other people staying around. Of course, my girlfriend and I take the master bedroom upstairs, and right across the hall is another couple in one room, and my girlfriend's cousin by herself in the 3rd room next door. All rooms are taken. In the middle floor is a lively area with games, a fireplace, and a foosball table. These details are somewhat relevant and important later in my story. The first night was a night of merry drinking and games. To celebrate the occasion, we had decorated the living area and blown up balloons to be loosely strewn around the large and cozy living room and family room where we invited. Almost eventful with respect to weird happenings, except towards the end of the night, balloons would randomly pop at odd intervals. Someone in our group suggested it was the balloons getting attracted towards the heater vents and popping. I was dismissive of this because not all of them that popped were congregated near vents. Cool. I just took note. Didn't want to argue or suggest anything weird at this point. After we all retired for the night and all lights were off, we could hear balloons pop downstairs at random intervals that reverberated through the silent house. This happened between 2 and 3:30 a.m. The next morning, still plenty of healthy balloons strewn about. Fast forward to night 2. After we return from snow activities, we prep for drinking and the usual. After a few days worth of shredding the snow, we are all collectively tired a bit earlier than the previous night and decide to retire around 11:30 to midnight. Here's where I experienced things that got me feeling irked. Since it was cold, I decided to go downstairs to turn on the thermostat heater. Our couple friends across the hall had their door slightly open and ajar, lights were on, and the bathroom was in use. As I am going downstairs in the dark stairwell, I hear floorboards behind me creak and figured it was my friend coming out to follow me for a cup of water or to go to the kitchen. As I walk across the living room and stop at the thermostat, the lights are still off at this point and the creaks continue, and then I hear it stop a few feet behind me near the kitchen. The kitchen lights don't turn on and I hear nothing else. Feeling like he was waiting behind me and I was being watched, I said, "What's up, dude? Need something?" I turn around and nobody is there. I've only ever read about this dreadful feeling of being watched, and it is indeed every bit dreadful upon realization in person. A minute ago I swore someone followed me down. I was taken aback, and my skeptical ass once again took note and spoke nothing of it. I go back upstairs. About 30 minutes pass, and it's still cold. At this point, everyone is asleep, and I decide to turn up the thermostat a couple notches. Nothing crazy. I turn on the upstairs hallway light, bright enough to light the steps and see from downstairs. I proceed to head downstairs and stop once again at the thermostat. No floorboard creaks, except for my own steps this time, as I'm turning up the thermostat and thinking to myself how odd the creaking was the first time. A noise broke my train of thought. I hear the ball from the foosball table several feet away near the fireplace audibly roll across its surface and hit one side of the wall. Nobody is around, and I certainly am too far to touch it. I froze in fear and hastily go back upstairs to sleep, not knowing how to mentally process the increasingly evident occurrences. I eventually sleep under the pretense that nothing is definitive enough for me to be conclusively sure that this cabin is haunted. I don't mention or wake anybody up about my experience. The next morning, as we leave and drive home, the balloons were brought up by my girlfriend's friend, the couple who stayed across the hall. I took this as an opening to talk about my experiences and disclose them. At this point, my girlfriend's friend goes pale, gets serious, and tells us that the previous night she was still wide awake when she noticed a dark figure standing at the foot of her bed. She states that she went into a panic mode after blinking and realizing it wasn't a dream or hallucination, and shook her boyfriend awake, who I thought followed me down the stairs earlier that night, only to have it disappear. This by far, coupled with my experiences, is undeniable evidence. I myself was wide-eyed upon hearing this solid piece of information. My girlfriend's cousin, who stayed in the room next to us, then mentions she heard what sounded like breathing in her room, but dismissed it as naturally occurring sound of the walls in the cabin. These events, stand alone, could be nominal and maybe explained, but collectively, it's hard to deny that something was present and amiss. I'm hoping this is the extent of my run-ins with the paranormal because I don't want to experience anything like this again. The universe has made me more of a believer. This one is by u/haunting happenings. The Ghost in the Woods. I love walking in the woods, but some strange things have happened in the woods. Have you had anything weird happen to you? This is one of my strangest things that happened to me. It was a beautiful day for a hike in the woods, so I grabbed my backpack and set out on the trail. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, and the leaves rustled gently in the breeze. As I walked deeper into the forest, I noticed that the sounds of nature had grown quieter. It was as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. That's when I saw her, a woman dressed in white, standing at the edge of a clearing. She looked like she was from another time, with a long flowing dress and a ribbon tied around her waist. At first I thought she might be lost or in trouble, so I approached her cautiously. But as I got closer, she vanished into thin air, leaving only the sound of rustling leaves behind. I was shaken, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to follow her, so I continued on the trail, my heart pounding in my chest. As I approached the clearing where I had seen the woman, I heard the faint sound of music. It was a haunting melody played on a violin. I stepped into the clearing and saw her again, the woman in white, dancing to the music of an unseen player. She twirled and spun, her dress billowing in the breeze. But then, as suddenly as before, she vanished again, leaving me alone in the clearing. I left the woods that day feeling haunted by the memory of the ghostly woman in the white. I never saw her again, but I'll never forget the feeling of being watched by something not quite of this world. So this is I Think I'm Haunted Part 2, so let's go and see Part 1. This is by you/Yoopdoodle. I think I'm haunted. Like the title says, I genuinely believe I myself, not the areas I've lived in or have been to, is haunted. I wish this could be shorter, but there's a whole lot to say and I'd appreciate some feedback. I also know that this community doesn't like sleep paralysis stories, but I know that mine weren't just sleep paralysis, but were paranormal encounters. As a kid, I went through a lot. It really messed me up when my dad left my mom, and it made me feel really unsafe. I don't know why, but I felt like something has been after me my whole life. No bullshit. I was strangely aware of death from a very young age, and it terrified me to even think of my family members dying. And I've had terrible nightmares about awful things happening to my brother, dad, or mom, starting at the age of 6, I can remember. I've also had sleep paralysis my entire life, but didn't know what it was until a few years ago. I also realized that the stories I mention here weren't really sleep paralysis, but real encounters. I do have sleep paralysis on occasion, but it is nothing like what I describe here. So on one hand, I was scared to fall asleep because of my awful nightmares, and on the other hand, I was terrified of seeing the things I saw then and still see today. I had 2 windows in my room, one behind my bed and the other next to my bed. I kept my curtains open because the street light made me more comfortable falling asleep than my night light, as all of my night lights would mysteriously lose battery life after a few days and would flash randomly on and off throughout the night and day or make clicky noises. I remember so clearly, as it happened frequently from when I was maybe 7 to age 12, when we moved out of the house, seeing a figure outside of my window. A moving figure, usually as dark as the night in some sort of robe, looked a lot like the ghost of Christmas Future. And the same figure occurred in many of my nightmares as well. It usually just planted a hand on the window or started banging on it and continued to do so until I fell asleep. Other times I'd wake up to my sleep paralysis. I genuinely saw the figure in the window because it always happened before I fell asleep and never woke me up in the middle of the night. So I know it wasn't sleep paralysis and I could move just fine. And a similar figure, dark but not robed and usually donned a white-brimmed hat, stood in the center of my room. He usually reached out to me, but other times he just stood there watching, even though I couldn't see if he had eyes. That was when I was a child and lived in that house. That was pretty much all the creepy stuff that happened there. Yet, I didn't really believe in ghosts until I was 13. The problem is, I'm pretty sure I'm the one that's haunted. My mom's apartment, after we moved from a previous house, which was new and no one had died in, so it's very mysterious that I had these experiences, is old as hell. This apartment was originally built in 1920 and was only recently barely restored. It has its problems like leaking ceilings and bugs, but that's about it. But maybe the first time I experienced anything here was when I was 13. My room was really messy, and the further half of my room, where my TV was set up. Very strangely, the 2 cats we had would not go past the front half of my room, toward my closet and TV. I was really curious about it one time and set my cat carefully in front of my TV where she screeched, not something she ever did, and sprinted out of my room. She was obsessed with me and mostly spent her time in my room, but only in the front half where my bed was. My mom even peeked in at her meowing at the TV one time when I was at my dad's. Then one night, I had gotten ready for bed and was about to lie down when I noticed the light coming from the other half of my room. My DVD player was on, and I hadn't used my TV or DVD player in months, and it hadn't been on just 30 minutes prior, so what the hell happened? I knew damn well the cats wouldn't go near it, so I went to turn it off, and the DVD player has this little screen on it that says what it's doing, things like searching, ejecting, turning off. But this time it said something that I've never ever seen it say before. Controls. It turns out that you can click on the settings button of the DVD player and click a few more options to get to the screen where it would say that. But I didn't press those buttons, and neither did the cats, so I turned it off and strangely fell asleep just fine. Little things that have happened in my mom's apartment since, but nothing that could be clearly described as a paranormal occurrence until the last few years. I changed my room around in my mom's apartment when I was 16. I got a bigger bed, and I put it on the wall in that far half of my room where the TV used to be, and put the TV in the front half of my room. The first thing I noticed was my old Kinect, which sat on top of the TV. It was a big TV box TV. I never used the Kinect, but it was connected to the Xbox and would turn on when I turned on the Xbox. I could see the little Kinect icon on my home screen and began noticing figures behind me, where my TV had been and now my bed was. But they didn't move. They were very humanoid, and nothing in my room would make those shapes, let alone show up so prominently on the Kinect. Then came the touching. I began to feel someone touching me all the time. I would lie in bed and feel someone slowly press up against me. I would be in my kitchen and suddenly feel someone touch my back or shoulder when no one else was home. I could even be in school standing behind my friends with no one else behind me and feel someone touch my shoulder. That's when I also realized that it wasn't just happening at home. Not to mention, my sleep paralysis began to get worse when I slept in my bed after it moved the paranormal side of the room. But it changed from that figure to other things like spiders crawling all over me, or a human intruder breaking into my room through my window and reaching in with their hand. I could see it, hear it all happening, but no one was there. I can now tell that that was real sleep paralysis instead of my paranormal kinds, as they were brief and didn't feel as threatening. My paranormal kind lasts hours, it feels, and is more ominous than threatening, even as a child. Then came the name calling. You know, the feeling you get when someone says your name, but they didn't. Now imagine that happening when no one's there. Everywhere I went, school, Dad's house, Mom's house, someone calling my name, usually in my own voice or some man's, but the voice was never creepy. If it was my voice, it sounded like I was screaming my own name. But if it was the man's, it sounded almost loving and caring. And no one was there. But the footsteps creeped me out the most. The footsteps started when my brother left for college, and my mom and I were left in her apartment alone. The footsteps also still happen today. My mom works a shitty schedule at a nearby hospital and goes to bed at around 7 p.m. to wake up at 3 a.m. I used to go to bed at around 10. My mom sleeps like shit. She always has and probably always will. So she wakes up in the middle of the night almost every night. One night when I was 16, I was lying in bed about to fall asleep when I heard some pots and pans banging in the kitchen. I was tired and I just assumed that my mom couldn't sleep and got up and did the dishes or something. Then I heard footsteps outside of my door and saw a shadow underneath. Kinda weird. My mom had zero reason to come near my door. The next day after she got home from work, I asked her what she was doing the night before. She said she slept great, and she didn't get up once. My mom didn't believe in ghosts, at least not spirits that would be around our small town or anything. If it was something bigger, and a lot happened there, or many people died, that was one thing. But when my mom started hearing the footsteps at night, she started to realize that the shit I've been saying might not be so crazy after all. She even started asking me if I had gotten up at night when I usually slept great and didn't get up at all. Occasionally, we've heard footsteps and have seen the shadow from underneath our doors together. Occasionally, we walk out just to see if we straight up have an intruder, just to see nothing there but continue hearing the footsteps go around the house where we're looking. I've heard my mom's voice, as if she was talking to someone when in reality she was fast asleep. I've seen things out of the corner of my eye, pale creatures on all fours with dark eyes. I've seen that thing out of the corner of my eyes all the time, regardless of where I am. Right before I left for college, I had sleep paralysis again, after not having it for a year. I was lying in my bed, and there was a strange bright light pointing toward the dark figure at the end of my bed with glowing red eyes and a wide-brimmed hat. But for some reason, this time I wasn't scared or even nervous. I had an overwhelming sensation of relief, and the only thought in my normally loud and buzzing head was literally, "Thank God you're here, I've missed you." I then fell asleep right after. I have no idea why I thought that. I hadn't seen this figure so clearly since the night I got my second COVID shot, which was about a year prior, and I was terrified of it then. But this was the only time it had red eyes. I never saw its eyes before. Part of me thinks that this was a new ghost or something, and I have to admit, I've been longing for that sense of relief I had when I saw him there at the end of the bed. But part of me is just so damn curious and wonders if this is the same ghost, but has had good intentions all along. Then I went to college. Nothing happened for months until I came back after Thanksgiving break, decided to drop out at the end of the semester. All of a sudden, I'd be in my dorm room and see that pale creature out of the corner of my eye again. All of a sudden, I'd feel the touches when I was lying on my bunk. All of a sudden, I'd hear that man's sweet voice call my name out of nowhere, and nothing to be found. Now I'm back home, and my nightmares lately have been particularly bad. My nightmares since I was a kid have always had three themes. I'm being chased, I'm being watched, or something is hurting my family. But my nightmares over the past few months have changed into I'm alone, my family needs me, someone is after me. Not to mention a single nightmare where my family was possessed and the only safe place to hide from them was in my room. This could have nothing to do with my ghost or anything, but I also think it's strange that the paranormal occurrences have been happening more often than not now and that I'm back home. The footsteps are back and I hear them almost every night. Last night, even, my door cracked open the slightest bit when I was playing a game on my computer. I see the pale creature all the time, peeking around doorways or scampering at the end of my bed. Frequently, I felt someone laying beside me, but now instead of being worried, I feel comforted. While the pale figures still terrify me, I genuinely miss that dark figure that I saw at the end of my bed. I wonder if the feeling that someone is laying next to me in my bed is the same spirit. I've tried talking to him. I say him because it's a rather overwhelming masculine presence that I feel. But without, actual ghost equipment, which may or may not even work, I can get an actual answer. All I can say is that it doesn't seem that he can move things, but can hear me. Maybe a week ago I was laying on my stomach when I felt someone slowly lay across my legs, kinda like a big dog. But my back stiffened, so right when I was about to roll over I said, "I'm gonna roll over now, but if you want to lay with me, you can after I move." And I rolled over and felt a whole body lay on top of me, to the point that I thought if I opened my eyes I would see his face. I opened my eyes, but obviously no one was there. I even looked down at my legs, still feeling numb and feeling the weight of someone on me when no one was there. But it was comforting. I've started calling him my ghostie, which he seems to care about me. I've considered that this could be like a ploy of a demon or something, but I don't feel drained. Now that I'm back home, I actually feel happier than I've been my entire life, ghosts and all. I think I could have created an egregore, a spirit that manifests out of mass feelings of sadness or depression, or something from trauma I had when I was a kid. I was very depressed as a little girl, and I remember contemplating offing myself when I was in first grade. But that wouldn't explain why I still have these experiences when I'm happy, and they're even stronger. And what are the pale creatures I see lurking around? I actually see those at my dad's house more often than here at my mom's, but I'll discuss what happened at my dad's places in another post. And why would I start being comforted by the same spirit that caused me so much fear and depression in the first place? I'd love to hear what everyone thinks of this. Am I haunted, or am I just going to coincidentally haunted places? Why would I specifically be targeted? I don't think we can get through this in a few minutes. So we'll try to get to it next time. Let's see if we can find a short one before the end of our time together this evening. Nope, that's a long one too. Probably do this one. This is by u/freed_dead7. Nope, we can't. I don't know. Let's see. I'll try to keep this relatively short, as there isn't a whole lot to do it. When I was a kid, I would stay over at my grandfather's house every other day while my mother was out doing stuff. Normally I didn't feel scared at his house unless it was late at night, but something happened in the morning when I was 4 years old. This particular morning, my aunt, who was staying upstairs for a period of time, had left the house before either me or my grandfather had awoke. Later, my grandfather, assuming she was still upstairs, had left to run some errands. I would sleep in the same bed as him, so when I woke up, I noticed he wasn't in his bed and called out for him. After a few minutes, I began to panic and got out of bed to run upstairs to see if my aunt was there, and that's when I saw it. A tall, pitch-black figure standing directly in front of her door, which was closed. There were literally no features on this figure, and it stood completely motionless. My best description is that it looked like a three-dimensional humanoid shadow. I began to creep towards it, but when I got close to it, I decided to just go back downstairs. Still panicking with tears in my eyes, I wasn't scared of the shadow, but I guess my human nature kicked in and told me not to get within arm's length of something I didn't understand. My mother discovered I was alone from talking to both my aunt and grandfather, sped over to his house as quickly as possible to pick me up. I was more afraid that I'd get in trouble for pissing the bed than I was of the shadow man upstairs. When I changed my clothes and got in the car, my mother asked me, "Did you try to go upstairs to see if your auntie was there?" To which I replied, "I tried, but that man was standing in front of the door." Keep in mind, this is coming from a 4-year-old who barely has a grasp on the concept of lying. Imagine hearing that from your kid randomly, of all things. I'm an adult now, and have heard from my mother that when she was younger and was staying over at my grandfather's house, that one night she woke up and saw 2 men talking in the hallway, but couldn't make out what they were saying. When she screamed to wake her dad up and turned back towards the hallway, they were gone. My grandfather's house is pretty old, so between these 2 experiences, I think there is at least one spirit haunting this house. I haven't really experienced any more paranormal stuff other than seeing a shadow of what looked like my dog running to the side of my bed. My buddy saw it too, but I'll never forget that tall, figureless figure. Well, guys, that's the end of our time together this evening on We Are Paradox Media's Late Night in the Rockies. Thank you guys so much to all my friends out there on We Are Paradox Media's Facebook, KPNL Radio, Twitter, Spreaker, iHeartRadio, and wherever else you may be listening beyond the Omniverse tonight. I had a wonderful time this evening, and I can't wait to do it again next weekend. Don't forget, we're all in this together. Together, we can make the world a little better. And together, my friends, we are Paradox Media, because without you, there is no us. If you would like to join us on... we're not going to do the after party tonight, but feel free to send me an email at weareparadoxmedia@gmail.com if you have any certain guests you'd like me to invite onto the show, and I will try my damnedest to get them here. Until next time, nighty-night, love and light. You guys take care of my yous, and stay safe out there in this crazy world. I'll see you back here, same crazy time,